God actually listens, which is rather preposterous. But the reason that's happening is to mitigate against exactly the problem that you described, which is to have the relationship with the transcendent degenerate into nothing but a blind obedience. And then the danger of that is, well, a blind obedience to who?
Jordan Peterson made about Islam. And according to him, his biggest problem with Islam, that it requires you to submit to God. According to him, this is an extremist's bizarre belief that exists uniquely in Islam. We can disagree on our interpretation of God's will and what's sin and what's not and all of that, but the act of submission in itself, I thought all Abrahamic faiths agree on that. Don't the Christian and the Jews submit to God as well?
And I see this as a threat in Islam, in the more fundamentalist forms of Islam. It's like, well, you should submit to Allah. It's like, hey, fair enough. Allah as interpreted by who? Oh, totalitarian, misogynistic mullahs. How about no? I don't buy your Allah. Okay, so let's not make it, okay, so let's agree that you shouldn't subordinate yourself arbitrarily to a rigid structure. Now, you might want to do that sporadically to discipline yourself, right? But the object shouldn't be submission. Now, what's weird in the biblical narrative, is that the goal is not submission. It's so weird. It's covenantal relationship. And covenantal relationship is actually relationship. So one of the things you see with Moses, for example, and you also see this with Abraham, is that they're constantly negotiating with God. That's why the name of my next book, by the way, is We Who Wrestle with God. It's a negotiation. It's not a submission. And so God is always threatening to wipe out the Israelites in the desert. He's just sick and tired of their idol worship and their whiny resentment and their bitterness and their worship of the past tyranny. And he's constantly threatening just to wipe them out and start again. And that's the apocalypse, I suppose. And Moses is constantly interceding on their behalf and telling God he shouldn't break his word.
Quran said to us, say, indeed, it is the guidance of Allah which is true guidance, and we have been commanded to submit to the Lord of all the worlds. Quran 6:71. There was much that Jordan Peterson said that is making the rounds on social media. First, I want to note that the way he pronounces Allah is a foreign sounding as he can possibly make it. He is an educated man, and he is well versed on how words are to be pronounced. However, certainly he has heard the way Muslims pronounce the word Allah, and so one wonders why he pronounces it in the way that he does. Jordan Peterson says, and I see this as a threat in Islam, in the more fundamentalist forms of Islam. It's like why you should submit to Allah. It's like, hey, fair enough Allah, as interpreted by who? This is actually a very liberal argument against our faith. Anyone who follows the fundamentals of their faith would be a fundamentalist.
I don't buy your Allah, and I don't
why?
see who made you right, precisely.
And even if I
so that's a
believed
big
in
problem.
the bearded guy in the sky, I'm not sure I need a middleman to talk to him, right?
Well, that makes you a good Protestant.
Well, maybe
but
that's
look,
what
we could also go down that rabbit hole a little bit, and it's worth it, because I also think this is how we ended up in this postmodern excess liberal conundrum. So Jung talked about Catholicism, as we mentioned, and he talked about the utility of and mercy of the confessional and that possibility of atonement. But he also laid out, the dangers of that. The dangers of the Catholic structure is, what would you say, a tilt towards authoritarian rigidity, which is what the Protestants rebelled against. But then the question is, well, what's the danger of the Protestant Revolution? And the danger is that everybody becomes his own church. And then here's the problem. You tell me what you think about this. Here's the logical conclusion of that. You're your own church. You're your own God. Now you can say what God said to Moses out of the depths of the burning bush. You can say, I am what I am. And I would say that's what the identity politics types do. They say, look, I am so superordinate in my own self-defining identity that no matter what identity claim I put forward, it is incumbent upon you to accept it as if it comes from an omniscient source. And I think, as far as I can tell, Constantine, that's where we are, right? Increasingly by force of law. If you make an identity claim, no matter how preposterous, which implies that there's some limit to identity claims, by the way.
Dr. Abdullah Ali posted a tweet. If Jordan B. Peterson believes that a Jewish rabbi claimed to be God 2,000 years ago and ordered Jews to drink his blood and eat his flesh, thus obliterating the very law that this God dictated to Moses on Sinai, then that is the height of blind submission. Zero logic and intellect. Aslo said in his tweet, "Smart man, but the thought of Islam being true seems to short-circuit his brain. I would blame it on his new boss, but he has always been disingenuous about how much of Islam he can or cannot understand."
Am I hearing you correctly?
But
if I look at what you're saying, then, are you suggesting that we need God to agree on truth?
I'm saying is that spirit which would enable us to agree on truth is, for all intents and purposes, equivalent to God, and necessarily so.
So without that, we cannot agree on what the truth is.
Well, the metaphysic that unites us has to be grounded in something that isn't merely political and semantic. That's the right way of thinking about it. There has to be something transcendental about it, akin to that experience you had
of connection to all humanity. Yes.
Okay, now look, Sam Harris thinks the same thing, which is why he's off in meditative space half the time, right? He has an unnameable God because then his semantic brain can't tear it to shreds. He understands that it's necessary to dip into the realm of the transcendent sporadically in order to renew yourself. And he'll say, well, that's not religious. It's like, well, it's not totalitarian and it's not systematic. That doesn't mean it's not religious. And then Harris, of course, his approach falls prey to the same problem as a kind of abstract Buddhism, which is, yeah, well, that's all well and good on the transcendental front, but how do you make that manifest in life, and how do you unite other people in that ethos? And that's a practical problem, and you need intermediary structures to do that.
Well, that's why I think religion is useful for uniting most people, because my experience is they need it.
What Jordan does not see is that he does not seem to recognize and understand who or what God is in relationship to him. We are in God's kingdom, this universe. God is the king. We as human beings are slaves. It is just that simple. Now you can be an obedient slave, or you can be a rebellious slave. It is through these acts of obedience to Allah that we become beloved to Allah, and that Allah becomes beloved to us. The language is strikingly intimate. In fact, through this submission, look at the status attained by none other than Abraham. Allah said in Quran, "And who is better in religion than one who submits himself to Allah while being a doer of good and follows the religion of Abraham, inclining toward truth? And Allah took Abraham as an intimate friend." Quran 4:125. Submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you. Job 22:21. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more interesting videos. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.